The photograph trembled in Detective Sarah Henley's weathered hands as she stared at the face she'd memorized 15 years ago, a face that belonged to a girl who should have grown into a woman, who should have celebrated birthdays and graduations, who should have lived. But Elowen Maren had been only 17 when she vanished from the Crescent Hills Shopping Center parking lot on a bitter February evening in 2009, leaving behind nothing but her car keys scattered in the snow and questions that had haunted an entire community. The fluorescent lights in the police station hummed with their familiar electric drone, casting harsh shadows across the evidence board that had become Sarah's obsession. Red yarn connected photographs, witness statements, and timeline markers like a spider's web of incomplete truths. At the center of it all was Elowen's senior portrait. Auburn hair catching golden light, green eyes bright with the kind of hope that only 17-year-olds possessed, a smile that suggested she believed the world held infinite possibilities. "You need to see this," Officer Marcus Webb said, his voice tight with the kind of controlled excitement that comes from years of disappointment suddenly giving way to breakthrough. He held a manila folder against his chest like a shield, as if the contents might escape if he loosened his grip. Marcus had been fresh out of the academy when Elowen disappeared, assigned to canvass neighborhoods and take statements from teenagers who spoke in whispers about their missing classmate. Now, at 38, he carried the weight of every unanswered question in the permanent lines around his eyes. Sarah set down the photograph with the reverence of someone handling sacred artifacts. The coffee in her mug had gone cold hours ago, but she lifted it to her lips anyway, tasting the bitter dregs of another sleepless night spent reviewing case files. The Elowen Maren case lived in a special section of her mind, a room she visited when other investigations reached dead ends, when the bureaucracy of modern policing threatened to smother her sense of purpose. "The DNA came back," Marcus continued, his voice falling into the station's ambient noise like stones into still water. "The sample from under her fingernails, the one that was too degraded back in '09, the new lab techniques, they managed to extract a profile." The folder crackled as he opened it, revealing laboratory reports covered in genetic sequences that looked like secret codes waiting to be deciphered. Sarah had requested the evidence be retested 6 months ago, part of a cold case initiative that the department had launched with federal funding. Most of the other detectives had focused on more recent cases, murders from the past 5 years where witnesses might still remember details, where security footage hadn't yet been destroyed or corrupted. But Sarah had chosen Elowen, had felt drawn to the girl whose story seemed frozen in time. "We got a match," Marcus said, and his voice carried the weight of 15 years' worth of prayers and frustration. "CODIS database hit this morning." Sarah's hands moved without conscious thought, fingers tracing the edges of the DNA report as she read the name that appeared in bold black letters. William James Thornfield. Date of birth, March 15, 1971. Address, 1247 Maple Street, Cedar Falls, IN, 47901. The name meant nothing to her, but names rarely did in cold cases. The real perpetrators were almost never the obvious suspects, the jealous boyfriends or troubled classmates that dominated the early weeks of investigation. They were ghosts who had learned to hide in plain sight, ordinary people who carried extraordinary secrets. 48 years old, Sarah read out loud, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her veins. Married, 2 children, works as maintenance supervisor at Cedar Falls Elementary School. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. A man who spent his days around children, trusted with keys to every door and access to every corner of a place where parents sent their most precious gifts. Sarah felt the familiar twist of nausea that came with confronting human darkness wrapped in mundane disguises. "Where was he in 2009?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Living in Millbrook," Marcus replied, "about 20 minutes from where Elowen disappeared. Worked maintenance at the community college there. Same type of job, different location." The connections began forming in Sarah's mind, like constellations emerging from darkness. Millbrook was close enough to Cedar Falls for someone to know the area, to understand the rhythms of a small community, the places where a teenage girl might feel safe walking alone. The Crescent Hills shopping center had been Elowen's regular haunt. She worked part-time at the bookstore and often stayed late to help with inventory or study in the quiet cafe that stayed open until 9 o'clock. His work schedule from back then? Sarah said, not really asking. Tuesday through Saturday, 6 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. He would have been off work by the time Elowen finished her shift at the bookstore. The timeline fit with sickening precision. Elowen had clocked out at 8:45 that February night, had texted her mother to say she was stopping by the pharmacy for shampoo before coming home. The pharmacy security cameras had captured her purchasing herbal essences and a pack of gum at 9:07. She'd walked to her car, a red Honda Civic her father had surprised her with for her 17th birthday, and then vanished as completely as if the earth had opened and swallowed her whole. Sarah reached for the evidence box that had lived under her desk for 3 years, the cardboard corners worn soft from handling. Inside were the physical remnants of Elowen's last known moments, the car keys scattered in the parking lot, still attached to a keychain shaped like a small leather journal that her English teacher had given her for writing poetry. The purse found in a dumpster 2 miles away, wallet intact but emptied of photographs. The single earring discovered a week later by a jogger, its silver surface tarnished by February snow. But it was the journal itself that Sarah lifted out with careful hands, a small bound notebook with a purple cover, pages filled with Elowen's careful handwriting. The entries painted a picture of a thoughtful teenager navigating the complex emotional landscape of her final year of high school. She wrote about college applications and scholarship interviews, about her job at the bookstore and the elderly customers who came in just to chat. She worried about her younger brother Jake, who was struggling with depression, and celebrated small victories like acing her calculus exam or finally perfecting her grandmother's recipe for lemon bars. "Listen to this," Sarah said, flipping to an entry dated February 10, 2009, just 4 days before Elowen disappeared. "There's this man who comes into the bookstore sometimes, usually right before closing. He never buys anything, just browses the mystery section and asks weird questions about my schedule. Today he wanted to know if I ever work alone, if the manager stays late. Something about him makes my skin crawl, but I can't put my finger on why. Maybe it's the way he watches me when he thinks I'm not looking, or how he always seems to know things about me that I never told him, like where I go to school, what classes I'm taking. I mentioned it to Mr. Peterson, but he said the guy seems harmless enough, just lonely. Still, I've started asking someone to walk me to my car when he's been in the store." The words hung in the air between them like a held breath. After 15 years of speculation and dead ends, here was Elowen's own voice describing what might have been her killer's stalking behavior. Sarah felt the familiar mix of triumph and grief that came with breakthroughs in cold cases, the satisfaction of progress tempered by the knowledge that it had come too late for the victim. "We need to bring him in," Marcus said, stating the obvious because sometimes the obvious needed to be said aloud, needed to be acknowledged as the moment when investigation shifted into action. "Carefully," Sarah replied. "He's been living a normal life for 15 years. If he's our guy, he's gotten comfortable, complacent. We don't want to spook him into running or destroying evidence." She closed the journal and returned it to the evidence box, but not before glancing once more at Elowen's handwriting, the careful loops and flourishes of someone who still believed words had power, who thought the act of writing could make sense of an increasingly complicated world. In 4 days, those hands would be fighting for life, leaving DNA evidence under their fingernails that would take 15 years and advances in forensic science to identify. The phone rang, cutting through their planning with its shrill demand for attention. Sarah answered without looking away from Thornfield's photograph, her mind already working through surveillance schedules and arrest procedures. "Detective Henley, this is Lieutenant Morrison. I need you and Webb in my office, now." The connection ended before Sarah could respond, leaving her staring at the receiver with the growing certainty that their carefully planned approach was about to be complicated by department politics or media pressure, or any of the dozen forces that turned investigations into public spectacles. "Morrison wants us upstairs," she told Marcus, who was already reaching for his jacket. As they walked through the bullpen, Sarah caught glimpses of her colleagues' work: domestic violence cases, drug arrests, the routine tragedies that filled police blotters in small Indiana towns. But today felt different, charged with the electric potential of resolution. After 15 years of wondering, the Maren family would finally have answers. After 15 years of living freely, William James Thornfield would finally face consequences. But first, they had to navigate whatever bureaucratic minefield awaited them in the lieutenant's office, where case files went to be buried under procedure and politics, where justice got tangled up in jurisdictional disputes and budget concerns. Sarah paused at the bottom of the stairwell, looking back at her desk, where Elowen's photograph still lay beside the DNA report. Somewhere in Cedar Falls, a man was going about his ordinary Thursday, perhaps repairing a broken water fountain or replacing burnt-out bulbs in a school hallway, perhaps coming home to a dinner prepared by his unknowing wife, perhaps helping his children with homework or discussing weekend plans. He had no idea that 15 years of careful anonymity were about to end, that the genetic evidence he'd left behind in a moment of violence was finally speaking loud enough to be heard. But what secrets had he been carrying all these years? What other darkness might emerge once they started pulling at the threads of his carefully constructed life? And how would a community that had trusted him with their children's safety process the revelation that a monster had been hiding among them, wearing the mask of a helpful neighbor and dedicated employee? The questions multiplied like shadows as Sarah climbed the stairs toward Morrison's office, each step taking her further from the familiar territory of investigation and closer to the unpredictable landscape of justice, where the ending of one story would inevitably become the beginning of many others. Elowen Maren had always been the kind of person who noticed things others missed. The way morning light caught dust motes dancing in the bookstore's front window, how Mrs. Chen from the flower shop always bought the same mystery novel every third Tuesday, but never seemed to remember the plot. The subtle changes in her younger brother's Jake's posture that warned of his darkening moods before anyone else in the family recognized the signs. It was this quality of attention, this gentle vigilance, that had made her both beloved in Cedar Falls and, ultimately, vulnerable to predators who understood that caring people often ignored their own warning signals in favor of giving others the benefit of the doubt. Her morning routine in those final weeks had become a meditation in small rebellions against the anxiety that had been growing like frost on her bedroom windows. She would wake at 6:30 to the sound of her father's shower running, the old pipes in their 1920s farmhouse creating a percussion that had served as her alarm clock since childhood. While coffee brewed downstairs, she would stand before her bedroom mirror, inherited from her grandmother, along with the matching vanity set, and practiced the kind of confidence she hoped to project during her upcoming college interviews. "I'm interested in studying English literature because stories have the power to change how we see the world," she would say to her reflection, watching her green eyes for any sign of the self-doubt that plagued her internal monologue. The words sounded hollow in the morning quiet, but she persisted, believing that confidence could be cultivated through repetition, that eventually her voice would catch up with her convictions. The journal beside her bed chronicled these daily struggles with the honesty of someone who expected her thoughts to remain private forever. She wrote about the weight of being the family's reliable child, the daughter her parents bragged about to neighbors and coworkers, the sister who could always coax Jake out of his worst episodes with patient listening and homemade chocolate chip cookies. But she also wrote about the loneliness of being seen as perpetually strong, the way people assumed she didn't need the same comfort and reassurance she so freely gave others. February 8, 2009. Sometimes I feel like I'm playing a character in someone else's story, The good daughter, the helpful sister, the responsible employee. Everyone has such clear expectations of who Elowen is supposed to be, and mostly I don't mind meeting them because it makes people happy and keeps things peaceful. But lately I've been wondering what would happen if I just stopped being who everyone needs me to be and started figuring out who I actually am underneath all these roles. Would anyone still love the real me? Or have I gotten so good at being what others need that I've lost track of my authentic self? Her job at Crescent Hills Books had become both sanctuary and stage for these internal conflicts. The store occupied a converted Victorian house on the town's main street, its rooms still divided according to their original domestic purposes. Fiction in what had been the living room, nonfiction spread across the former dining room and kitchen, children's books tucked into the cozy space that had once been a breakfast nook. Elowen loved the way the building's architecture created intimate reading corners where customers could disappear into stories. But she also appreciated the clear sightlines that allowed her to monitor the entire store from the central checkout counter. Mr. Peterson, the owner, had hired her during her junior year, after she'd spent an entire afternoon helping him reorganize the poetry section according to chronological periods rather than alphabetical order. He was a gentleman in his 60s who treated books like old friends, and customers like potential converts to the religion of reading. Under his mentorship, Elowen had discovered authors who wrote about the kinds of internal landscapes she recognized from her own experience. Virginia Woolf's Explorations of Consciousness, Maya Angelou's Investigations of Identity, Adrienne Rich's fierce examinations of what it meant to be a woman in a world that often demanded invisibility. But it was in the mystery section that she first encountered the man who would later become the central figure in her final journal entries. She had been reshelving returns on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in late January when she noticed him browsing the same shelf of hardcover thrillers for the third time that week. He was unremarkable in the way that made people forget faces immediately. Medium height, brown hair beginning to thin, clothes that suggested steady employment but not prosperity. What struck her as odd was his behavior. He would pick up books, read the back covers with exaggerated attention, then replace them exactly where he'd found them, as if he were performing the act of shopping rather than actually searching for something to purchase. "Can I help you find anything specific?" she had asked, approaching with the customer service smile she'd perfected over months of retail work. "Just browsing," he'd replied, but his eyes had moved across her face with an intensity that made her step back slightly. "You're very knowledgeable about books for someone so young. Do you go to the high school here?" The question seemed innocent enough, the kind of small talk that filled interactions in a town where everyone was separated by no more than 2 degrees of connection. But something in his tone, a too casual curiosity, had triggered the same instinct that made her avoid certain streets after dark, or trust her first impressions of people even when she couldn't articulate why. She'd be answered, "I'm a senior," then immediately regretted the specificity, then tried to redirect the conversation back to safer territory. "Are you looking for a particular author or genre? We just got some new releases in the mystery section." But he had seemed more interested in her educational experience than in books, asking about her classes, her teachers, whether she was involved in extracurricular activities. Each question built upon the previous one with a methodical quality that reminded her of the way Jake approached complicated math problems, systematically gathering information to solve an equation. The realization had made her skin crawl, though she couldn't have explained it to someone who hadn't witnessed the interaction. January 28, 2009. That man came in again today, the one who asks too many questions and never buys anything. I tried to avoid him by staying busy in the back room, but he hung around until almost closing time. When I finally had to come out to lock up, he was waiting by the poetry section. Not reading, just standing there like he was expecting me. He asked if I ever work alone, if Mr. Peterson stays late, how I get home after dark. I told him my dad picks me up, which isn't true most nights, but something about his interest felt wrong. Like he was collecting information for reasons I don't want to think about too clearly. I keep telling myself I'm being paranoid, that he's probably just lonely and socially awkward. Cedar Falls is full of people who don't quite know how to make normal conversation, especially with teenagers who represent some kind of youth they feel they've lost. But there's a difference between awkward and predatory, and I'm starting to think this guy falls on the wrong side of that line. The entries that followed documented a escalating pattern of encounters that never quite crossed the boundary into obviously inappropriate behavior, but left Elowen feeling increasingly unsettled. He began timing his visits to coincide with her shifts, arriving within an hour of her start time and lingering until she began her closing procedures. He learned her name from her employee badge and started using it frequently, as if the repetition could create a familiarity that didn't actually exist. He brought her small gifts, a bookmark shaped like a dragonfly, a packet of herbal tea, a pen with her name printed on the side, each offering accompanied by explanations that sounded reasonable but felt calculated. "I saw this and thought of you," he would say, presenting these tokens with the nervous energy of someone who had rehearsed the interaction. "You mentioned liking nature poetry, and dragonflies are symbols of transformation in many cultures." Elowen had accepted the gifts out of politeness and uncertainty, unsure whether rejecting them would escalate the situation or diffuse it. She had no framework for understanding this kind of attention. Her dating experience consisted of a handful of school dances and one brief relationship with a classmate that had ended amicably when they realized they functioned better as friends than as romantic partners. The adult world of complicated motivations and hidden agendas remained largely theoretical to her, something she encountered in books rather than in her daily life. But her instincts, shaped by 17 years of observing human behavior and countless mystery novels, insisted that something was fundamentally wrong with these interactions. She began varying her schedule when possible, taking different routes to and from work, asking friends to accompany her during her shifts when their schedules allowed. She mentioned her concerns to Mr. Peterson, who listened with the distracted attention of someone dealing with inventory shortages and declining foot traffic in an era when online shopping was killing independent bookstores. "He seems harmless enough," Mr. Peterson had said, not unkindly, but without the urgency Elowen felt the situation deserved. "Probably just enjoys having someone intelligent to talk to about books. You know how lonely some people get, especially during the winter months." The dismissal stung, not because she doubted Mr. Peterson's good intentions, but because it highlighted how difficult it was to communicate danger that hadn't yet manifested in obviously threatening behavior. How could she explain that the man's attention felt like a weight pressing against her chest, that his questions seemed designed to map the boundaries of her life rather than to make conversation? How could she articulate that safety wasn't just the absence of overt threat, but the presence of respect for boundaries and the acknowledgement of her right to comfortable distance? Her parents, when she finally worked up the courage to mention the situation, responded with the protective instincts of people who had raised their daughter to be cautious but not paranoid. Her mother, Linda, had grown up in Cedar Falls during an era when children roamed freely and strangers were assumed to be harmless unless proven otherwise. Her father, Tom, possessed the optimistic worldview of someone whose job as a high school guidance counselor had shown him more of human resilience than human darkness. "Trust your instincts," Linda had advised over dinner one February evening, "but remember that not every awkward interaction is a dangerous one. Some people just don't know how to relate to teenagers appropriately." "Maybe I should have a conversation with him," Tom had suggested, his protective instincts warring with his professional understanding of how easily situations could be misinterpreted. Let him know you're not comfortable with the attention. But Elowen had resisted the idea of parental intervention, partly out of typical teenage independence and partly out of fear that direct confrontation might escalate whatever was happening into something more explicitly threatening. She had decided instead to handle the situation through avoidance and professional distance, unaware that her stalker was interpreting her politeness as encouragement and her availability as invitation. February 12, 2009. He knows things about me that I never told him. Today he mentioned that I'm applying to Indiana University, that I want to study English literature, that my brother is having trouble in school. I've never discussed any of these topics with him, which means he's either getting information from other people or he's paying much closer attention to my life than just our bookstore conversations would explain. The thought of him asking questions about me around town makes me feel sick. What has he been telling people?
What reason does he give for wanting to know so much about some random teenage girl? I've started parking on different streets and taking different routes home, but it's a small town, and there are only so many ways to get from point A to point B. Yesterday, I thought I saw his car, a dark blue sedan with Indiana plates, in the parking lot at the grocery store when Mom sent me to pick up milk. It could have been a coincidence, but it was the third time this week I've noticed that car in places where I happen to be. I'm probably overreacting. That's what everyone keeps telling me, and maybe they're right. Maybe he's just socially awkward and doesn't realize how his behavior comes across. Maybe I've read too many mystery novels and I'm seeing sinister motives where there are just clumsy attempts at friendship. But I can't shake the feeling that something is very wrong, that all of this attention is building towards something I don't want to imagine. 2 days later, Elowen Maren would clock out of her shift at Crescent Hills Books for the final time, walk to her red Honda Civic with keys jingling against the journal-shaped keychain, and disappear into a February night that would swallow her whole. But in these final entries, her voice remained strong, her instincts clear, her sense of self intact, despite the pressure of being everyone's reliable daughter, helpful sister, and responsible employee. She had been right about the danger, right about the predatory nature of the attention she was receiving, right to trust the warning signals that others had dismissed as paranoia or overreaction. Her journal became the voice she couldn't raise loud enough in life, the testimony that would take 15 years to be heard and understood, the evidence that would finally bring justice to a girl who had noticed everything and tried to protect herself with the tools available to someone who still believed the adult world would listen when she asked for help. The first sign that William James Thornfield's carefully constructed life was beginning to unravel came not from the police investigation, but from his own wife's growing suspicions about his behavior during the weeks leading up to Elowen's disappearance. Margaret Thornfield had been married to him for 22 years, long enough to recognize the subtle shifts in his routine that preceded his periods of what she privately called restlessness, times when he would disappear for hours without explanation, return home with clothes that smelled of unfamiliar places, and spend long nights sitting at their kitchen table, staring out the window, as if waiting for something that never came. In February 2009, Margaret had been too focused on their own family struggles to pay close attention to her husband's increasingly erratic schedule. Their daughter Emma was failing algebra, their son Michael was being bullied at school, and Margaret's own mother was in the early stages of dementia, requiring daily phone calls and weekend visits that left everyone emotionally drained. It was easier to accept William's explanations about overtime at the community college, emergency repairs that couldn't wait until morning, work friends who needed help with home projects, than to investigate the growing list of inconsistencies in his stories. But the night Elowen disappeared, Margaret had been awake with a migraine when William's truck pulled into their driveway at 2:47 a.m. She had watched through their bedroom window as he sat in the cab for nearly 10 minutes, motionless in a way that suggested he was gathering himself for some kind of performance. When he finally entered the house, his clothes were muddy and his hands were scratched, details she noticed but didn't question until years later when the guilt of her silence became unbearable. "Rough night at work?" she had asked, her voice muffled by the pillow she pressed against her throbbing skull. "Frozen pipes in the science building," he had replied without hesitation, as if he had rehearsed the explanation in the 10 minutes in the truck. "Had to crawl under the building to get to the shutoff valve. Took longer than expected." The lie was smooth enough to pass casual scrutiny, detailed enough to discourage follow-up questions, and delivered with the weary frustration of someone who had genuinely been dealing with an emergency. But Margaret had noticed that his clothes were dirty, with what looked like ordinary soil, rather than the kind of mud that accumulated around building foundations, and his scratches appeared to come from thorns or brambles, rather than from crawling through tight spaces. She had filed these observations away without examining them too closely, choosing trust over suspicion because marriage required a certain willful blindness to survive. The Cedar Falls Police Department's initial investigation had focused primarily on Elowen's immediate social circle, classmates, co-workers, family friends, who might have harbored
romantic feelings or personal grudges. Detective Ray Holbrook, who had handled the case before his retirement in 2018, had pursued every obvious lead with methodical thoroughness. The boy who had asked Elowen to prom and been gently rejected. The former employee at the bookstore who had been fired for inventory discrepancies. The college student who had seemed overly interested in her during a poetry reading at the library. But Holbrook had also received dozens of tips from community members who remembered seeing unfamiliar cars in various locations, strangers who had asked unusual questions, interactions that seemed innocent at the time but took on sinister significance after a teenage girl vanished. One of those tips had mentioned a maintenance worker from the community college who had been seen at Crescent Hills Shopping Center on several occasions, always alone, always during evening hours when most employees had gone home for the day. Middle-aged guy, kind of forgettable looking, the tipster had told Holbrook during a phone interview. "I noticed him because he was sitting in his truck in the parking lot, just watching people come and go. Not reading, not on his phone, just watching. I saw him there maybe 3 or 4 times over a couple of weeks. Didn't think much of it until the girl went missing." Holbrook had dutifully followed up on the tip, driving to the community college to speak with the maintenance supervisor about employees who might have reason to be in the shopping center area after hours. The supervisor had provided a list of names, including William Thornfield, along with character references that painted him as reliable, hardworking, and respected by his colleagues. When Holbrook had called to schedule an interview, Thornfield had been cooperative and seemingly eager to help, volunteering to come to the police station at his earliest convenience. "I heard about that poor girl on the news," Thornfield had told Holbrook during their 40-minute conversation on March 3, 2009. "Terrible thing. Her parents must be going through hell." The interview had been routine, following protocols designed to eliminate innocent people from suspicion rather than to identify guilty ones. Thornfield had provided an alibi for the night of February 14, dinner with his family, then an evening of watching television and helping his son with a school project. He had acknowledged shopping at Crescent Hills occasionally, but claimed no specific memory of being there during the time frame in question. He had expressed appropriate concern for Elowen's welfare and offered to submit to any additional questioning that might be helpful. Holbrook had noted that Thornfield was calm but not cold, concerned but not overly emotional, helpful but not suspiciously eager to insert himself into the investigation. His answers had been consistent with his initial statements, his body language had suggested nervousness appropriate to the situation, and his willingness to cooperate had indicated either innocence or the kind of calculated cooperation that experienced criminals understood was necessary to avoid suspicion. But there had been one detail that had nagged at Holbrook throughout the interview and for years afterward. When shown Elowen's photograph, Thornfield had studied it with what seemed like genuine recognition
rather than the blank confusion of someone seeing a stranger's face. He had covered this moment quickly, claiming that her picture had been in the newspaper and on television. But Holbrook had noted the instant of familiarity that had preceded the explanation. "I think I may have seen her around town," Thornfield had added unprompted. "She looks familiar, but I can't place where. Maybe at the shopping center or the library. Pretty girl. Someone her age should be thinking about college and prom, not dealing with whatever happened to her." The comment had struck Holbrook as both compassionate and slightly inappropriate, the kind of observation that revealed more familiarity with the victim than a casual acquaintance would possess. But without additional evidence, the detective had been unable to justify more intensive investigation of a man who had no criminal record, a stable family life, and the support of his employer and colleagues. The case had gone cold, not for lack of effort, but for lack of physical evidence connecting any of the potential suspects to Elowen's disappearance. Her car keys had yielded no usable fingerprints. Her purse had been handled by garbage collectors and dumpster divers before being recovered, and the wooded areas where search teams had focused their efforts had been contaminated by dozens of volunteers who had unknowingly destroyed potential crime scenes in their eagerness to help. For 15 years, Thornfield had watched the anniversary coverage of Elowen's disappearance with what his family interpreted as community-minded concern, but what was actually a mixture of guilt, fear, and perverse satisfaction at having successfully concealed his crime. He had attended the memorial services held each February 14th, had contributed to the reward fund established by her parents, had expressed sympathy to neighbors who mentioned the case in casual conversation.
But he had also been unable to resist returning to the locations associated with his crime, driving past the bookstore where he had first seen Elowen, parking in the shopping center lot where he had taken her, visiting the wooded area where her body had never been found. These pilgrimages had become a form of psychological compulsion, a way of reliving the sense of power and control that had motivated the original crime. Margaret had begun to notice these unexplained absences around the 5th anniversary of Elowen's disappearance, when William had started taking long drives on February evenings and returning home with the same distant, satisfied expression she had learned to associate with his restless periods. She had assumed he was having an affair, had even prepared herself for the conversation that would inevitably follow her discovery of evidence. But when she had finally found the courage to search his truck for signs of infidelity, she had instead found newspaper clippings about Elowen's case, printed emails from the Cedar Falls Police Department's tip line, and photographs of the memorial that had been erected in Riverside Park. The discovery had been more disturbing than evidence of adultery would have been, because it suggested an obsession with violence rather than simple marital dissatisfaction. But Margaret had been unable to process the implications fully, unable to connect her husband's interest in the case with the possibility that he might have been personally involved. She had rationalized the collection as evidence of civic-minded concern taken to an unhealthy extreme, had convinced herself that some people became fixated on local tragedies as a way of processing their own fears and anxieties. It wasn't until 2019, when William's behavior became even more erratic around the 10-year anniversary, that Margaret had begun to consider darker possibilities. He had started talking about Elowen as if he had known her personally, sharing details about her personality and interests that had never been reported in the media. He had expressed opinions about the investigation's shortcomings with the authority of someone who had inside knowledge of the case. He had begun criticizing the police department's efforts with a vehemence that seemed personal rather than philosophical. They never looked in the right places, he had told Margaret over dinner one February evening, his voice tight with frustration, that seemed disproportionate to his supposed role as concerned citizen. Too focused on the obvious suspects, not willing to consider that whoever took her might have been smarter than they assumed. "How could you possibly know what they did or didn't investigate?" Margaret had asked, her question carrying 15 years' worth of accumulated suspicions. "I pay attention," William had replied, but his defensive tone had suggested that her question had touched a nerve.
I read the newspaper, watch the news coverage. It's obvious they bungled the investigation from the beginning. That conversation had marked the beginning of Margaret's conscious awareness that her husband might be more connected to Elowen's disappearance than he had ever admitted. But awareness and action were separated by a chasm of fear, loyalty, and disbelief that she had been unable to cross. The man who coached Little League Baseball, who helped neighbors with home repairs, who had been a faithful husband and devoted father for more than 2 decades, could not possibly be the monster who destroyed a teenage girl's life and devastated an entire community. Or could he? The question had haunted Margaret through sleepless nights and distracted days, coloring every interaction with her husband, every family gathering where he played the role of devoted family man, every community event where neighbors praised his helpfulness and reliability. She had begun watching him with the hyper-vigilance of someone who suspected they were living with a predator, noting the way his eyes followed young women in grocery stores, the casual questions he asked about their children's schedules and activities, the routes he chose when driving through town that always seemed to pass by schools and parks. But Margaret's growing suspicions remained trapped in the prison of her own disbelief and fear. Who would believe her accusations against a man with no criminal record, no history of violence, no obvious red flags that would make him a viable suspect? And what would happen to their children? Emma, now 26 and planning her wedding, Michael, 24 and starting his career as an engineer, if their father was revealed to be a killer? How could she destroy their lives based on suspicions that might be the product of an overactive imagination fed by too many true crime documentaries and magazine articles about hidden psychopaths?
The weight of this terrible knowledge had isolated Margaret from everyone she might have turned to for support. She couldn't confide in her sister without betraying her husband's privacy and potentially destroying their relationship over what might be unfounded fears. She couldn't seek counseling without risk of the therapist being obligated to report her suspicions to authorities. She couldn't even pray about it properly because asking God for guidance about whether her husband was a murderer felt like a betrayal of everything their marriage was supposed to represent. Meanwhile, William's position at Cedar Falls Elementary School had given him access to hundreds of children over the years, each interaction monitored by administrators who saw only his competent maintenance work and helpful demeanor. Principal Janet Martinez had recommended him for Employee of the Month 3 times, praising his willingness to stay late when needed and his gentle approach with students who were having behavioral difficulties. Preparing and narrating this type of story took as long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Mr. Thornfield has a gift for calming upset children, Martinez had written in his most recent performance review. Just last week, he helped diffuse a situation with a 2nd grader who is having a meltdown by patiently talking to her about her pet hamster while fixing a broken desk in her classroom. The children trust him, and that trust makes our job easier. The irony of these evaluations would become horrifying in retrospect, but at the time, they had simply confirmed what everyone in the Cedar Falls School District already believed. William Thornfield was exactly the kind of employee they wanted around their children: reliable, kind, and utterly trustworthy. The background checks required for school employment had revealed nothing concerning because his crime had remained undetected and his public persona had been carefully crafted to deflect suspicion. But there had been incidents over the years that, when viewed through the lens of later knowledge, formed a pattern of inappropriate interest in young girls. In 2012, a 6th-grade teacher had mentioned to the principal that Thornfield seemed to find excuses to work in her classroom whenever her class included a particular student, a girl with auburn hair and green eyes who bore a striking resemblance to Elowen. The teacher had described feeling slightly uncomfortable with the frequency of his visits and the intensity of his attention to the girl, but had been unable to point to any specific behavior that crossed professional boundaries. "He's always very appropriate," the teacher had explained to Principal Martinez during their brief conversation. I can't point to anything he's done wrong, exactly. It's more about frequency and focus. He seems to have legitimate reasons for being in my room, fixing a radiator, replacing light bulbs, checking the windows, but somehow there's always something that needs attention when Sarah Mitchell is there.
Martinez had spoken to Thornfield about the teacher's concerns in the most diplomatic way possible, framing it as a reminder about maintaining appropriate professional boundaries rather than an accusation of wrongdoing. His response had been perfectly calibrated. Surprised but not defensive. Apologetic but not guilty. Eager to address the concern without appearing to take it too seriously. "I had no idea my presence was making Miss Henderson uncomfortable," he had told Martinez, with what seemed like genuine concern. "I certainly never intended to single out any particular student for attention. Sarah's a sweet kid who reminds me of my own daughter at that age. Maybe I have been unconsciously more attentive to her because of that resemblance, but I understand how that could be misinterpreted." The explanation had satisfied Martinez, who filed the incident as a minor communication issue resolved through professional dialogue. Thornfield had been more careful after that, spacing out his visits to individual classrooms and maintaining more formal interactions with students. But he had also begun paying closer attention to which teachers were likely to report concerns and which ones were too polite or too overwhelmed to question his presence. By 2015, he had developed a sophisticated understanding of how to exploit the trust and assumptions that allowed him to move freely through the school environment. He knew which hallways were monitored by security cameras and which areas remained blind spots. He understood the daily rhythms that left certain spaces temporarily unsupervised, the 10 minutes between lunch periods when the cafeteria was empty, the half-hour after school when teachers were in meetings and children waited for late buses, the early morning minutes before custodial staff arrived but after he had already accessed the building. This knowledge had never escalated into obvious criminal behavior within the school setting, but it had fed his fantasy life and reinforced his sense of power over the children and families who trusted him. He had begun collecting small personal items left behind by students, hair ties, pencils, notebooks, keeping them in a locked box in his garage that Margaret had assumed contained work tools or seasonal decorations. The psychological profile that would later be constructed by FBI behavioral analysts would identify this period as Thornfield's maintenance phase, during which he had satisfied his compulsions through increasingly sophisticated stalking behavior and trophy collection, while avoiding the risks associated with actual violence. The murder of Elowen Maren had been an aberration, a moment when opportunity and impulse had overcome his usually careful risk assessment. But the success of that crime, his ability to kill a teenage girl and dispose of her body without detection, had also created a psychological precedent that made future violence more likely. The only thing that had prevented additional murders was his access to alternative sources of satisfaction through his school position and the gradual aging of his preferred victim type beyond his immediate environment. Detective Sarah Henley's investigation would eventually uncover evidence of at least 6 other young women who had reported being stalked or followed by a man matching Thornfield's description between 2009 and 2024. These reports had been filed with different law enforcement agencies across 3 counties, preventing the recognition of a pattern that might have identified him as a serial predator years earlier. Jennifer Walsh, who had been 19 in 2011 when she noticed a man following her home from her job at a Millbrook restaurant, had reported the incidents to local police but had been unable to provide enough detail for investigators to identify a suspect. The stalking had stopped abruptly after 2 weeks, which she had attributed to increased police patrols in her neighborhood. In reality, Thornfield had simply moved on to a different target when he realized that Jennifer was dating a boyfriend who picked her up from work and who had become suspicious enough to start watching for unwanted attention.
Lisa Rodriguez had experienced similar stalking behavior in 2014, with a man appearing at her workplace, following her car, and even showing up at her apartment complex on multiple occasions. She had installed security cameras and filed police reports, but the stalking had ended before investigators could establish surveillance or gather evidence. Again, Thornfield had simply calculated that the risk of detection outweighed the satisfaction he was deriving from the pursuit. Each of these cases represented a near miss, a moment when law enforcement had come close to identifying a pattern that could have prevented years of psychological terrorism inflicted on young women throughout southern Indiana. But the fragmented nature of jurisdictional boundaries, the limitations of information sharing between agencies, and the subtle nature of stalking behavior that stopped short of obvious criminality had allowed Thornfield to continue his predatory activities undetected. The most disturbing aspect of these cases was the evidence they provided of Thornfield's evolving sophistication as a predator. Unlike opportunistic criminals who acted on impulse, he had developed systematic approaches to identifying, researching, and pursuing victims who fit his preferred profile. He had learned to abandon pursuits that became too risky, to vary his methods to avoid detection, and to satisfy his compulsions through increasingly elaborate fantasy scenarios that stopped just short of physical violence. This pattern of behavior had been interrupted only by Elowen's case, where some combination of factors, perhaps her youth, her vulnerability, the familiarity he had developed through his stalking at the bookstore, had caused him to cross the line from psychological terrorism into murder. The success of that crime, combined with his ability to evade detection, had then informed his approach to subsequent stalking behavior, making him both more careful and more confident in his ability to terrorize young women without consequences. But time and advancing forensic science had finally created the conditions for justice. The DNA evidence that had been too degraded to analyze in 2009 could now be processed with techniques that extracted usable genetic profiles from microscopic traces of biological material. The tip lines and digital records that had seemed promising but ultimately fruitless 15 years ago could now be cross-referenced using databases and analytical tools that hadn't existed when Elowen first disappeared. Most importantly, the accumulation of behavioral evidence, witness statements, police reports, even Margaret's growing suspicions had created a circumstantial case that could support the biological evidence now available. The man who had successfully hidden his nature for decades was about to discover that secrets had their own half-life. The truth had a way of surviving even the most careful attempts at concealment. As Detective Henley and Officer Webb climbed the stairs toward Lieutenant Morrison's office, carrying the DNA report that would finally bring justice for Elowen Maren, they were also carrying the hopes of every young woman who had ever felt the cold touch of unwanted attention, every parent who had worried about a daughter's safety, every community member who had spent 15 years wondering whether a killer was walking freely among them. The answer to that question was about to transform from suspicion into certainty, from cold case into active arrest warrant, from lingering doubt into undeniable truth. William James Thornfield's carefully constructed life of respectability and trust was about to collapse under the weight of genetic evidence that would speak for a victim whose voice had been silenced, but whose fight for justice had never truly ended. Lieutenant Morrison's office carried the institutional weight of 30 years' worth of difficult conversations, its walls lined with commendations and photographs that documented the evolution of law enforcement in a small Indiana town. Behind his desk hung a framed picture of the 1995 Police Academy graduating class, young faces full of optimism about their ability to protect and serve, unaware of how cases like Elowen Maren's would test every assumption they held about justice and closure. "Close the door," Morrison said, without looking up from the documents spread across his desk. At 58, he had developed the economy of movement that came from managing too many cases with too few resources. Every gesture calculated to maximize efficiency in a profession where wasted time could mean lost lives. "What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room until we have our ducks in a row." Sarah exchanged glances with Marcus, recognizing the tone that preceded either career-making breakthroughs or career-ending disasters. Morrison's weathered hands moved across crime scene photographs and laboratory reports, with the careful attention of someone who had learned that details mattered more than drama. That thorough preparation prevented the kind of courtroom disasters that allowed guilty people to walk free on technicalities. "The DNA match is solid," Morrison continued, finally meeting their eyes. "I've had 3 different labs confirm the results, and the chain of custody is clean. William James Thornfield's genetic material was under Elowen Maren's fingernails, which means she fought back, which means he was there when she died." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, carrying implications that reached far beyond the simple fact of identification. After 15 years of speculation and dead ends, they finally had scientific proof that connected a specific individual to Elowen Maren's disappearance. But proof and conviction were separated by the complex machinery of criminal justice, where defense attorneys specialized in creating reasonable doubt, and procedural errors could nullify even the strongest evidence. "What about his family?" Sarah asked, her mind already working through the logistics of arrest and interrogation. Wife, children, community connections that might complicate the takedown? Margaret Thornfield, married 22 years, 2 adult children, both still living in the area. He's been working at Cedar Falls Elementary for 8 years, before that at the community college in Millbrook. No criminal record, not even a traffic violation in the past decade. Morrison's voice carried the bitter irony of discovering that monsters often wore the most convincing masks. His neighbors describe him as helpful and reliable. His supervisor says he's Employee of the Month material. His pastor calls him a pillar of the community. Marcus shifted in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. Classic case of the good neighbor who turns out to be hiding something horrific. How do we approach this without tipping him off? Very carefully. Morrison consulted notes that had been typed rather than handwritten, suggesting he had been preparing for this conversation longer than the morning's DNA results would indicate. "I've been in contact with the prosecutor's office. They want to move fast, but they also want to make sure we don't give his defense team any ammunition for claims of harassment or procedural violations." Sarah felt the familiar tension that preceded major arrests, the electricity that came from knowing that years of investigation were about to culminate in either justice or disappointment. But this case carried additional weight because of its age, its prominence in the community's collective memory, and the absolute certainty that the arrest would transform from law enforcement matter into media spectacle within hours of becoming public.
"Judge Barrett has already signed the warrant," Morrison continued, sliding the document across his desk for their inspection. "Arrest and search, both his residence and his workplace. We're coordinating with the school district to minimize disruption to the children, but there is no way to keep this completely quiet." The warrant represented the transformation of suspicion into legal reality. But it also marked the beginning of a process that would affect dozens of lives beyond Thornfield's immediate family. The children who had trusted him, the parents who had felt safe leaving their kids in his care, the community members who had accepted him as one of their own, all would be forced to reconcile their experience of him with the emerging truth about his capacity for violence. "Media strategy?" Marcus asked, though they all knew that controlling information flow would be impossible once the arrest became public. "We stick to the facts. We protect the integrity of the investigation, and we remember that Elowen's family deserves to hear about this development from us rather than from reporters camped outside their house." Morrison's expression softened slightly, revealing the human cost of police work that often got lost in discussions of procedure and protocol. "I called Tom and Linda this morning. They're driving up from Florida, where they moved after Tom retired. They'll be here by this afternoon." Sarah had met Elowen's parents several times over the years, had watched them age from middle-aged people devastated by loss into grandparents who had learned to carry grief as a permanent weight. Tom Maren had left his job as a guidance counselor 2 years after his daughter's disappearance, unable to see teenagers in crisis without being reminded of his failure to protect his own child. Linda had thrown herself into victim advocacy work, channeling her pain into efforts to help other families navigate the criminal justice system. "They've been waiting 15 years for this phone call," Sarah said, her voice tight with the emotional complexity of delivering news that was simultaneously the best and worst thing that could happen to grieving parents. Part of them probably stopped believing it would ever come. Which is why we need to get this right, Morrison replied. No mistakes, no shortcuts, no assumptions that could compromise the prosecution. Thornfield has been free for 15 years because we didn't have enough evidence to arrest him. Now we do, but that evidence has to be presented perfectly, or his lawyers will find ways to exclude it. The knock on Morrison's door interrupted their planning, followed immediately by the entrance of ADA Patricia Collins, whose presence indicated that the case had already moved beyond the investigative phase into prosecution preparation. Collins was known for her meticulous approach to case building and her ability to anticipate defense strategies that could derail seemingly solid convictions. "I've reviewed the DNA evidence and the circumstantial case," Collins said without preamble, settling into the chair beside Marcus with the efficiency of someone who understood that time was now a critical factor. "The genetic match is unassailable, but the defense will argue contamination, mishandling, or delayed processing. We need to be prepared to address every possible challenge to the chain of custody." Sarah appreciated Collins' direct approach, her willingness to acknowledge potential weaknesses rather than celebrating prematurely. Too many cases had been lost because prosecutors had overestimated the strength of their evidence or underestimated the creativity of defense attorneys looking for reasonable doubt. What about the stalking behavior documented in Elowen's journal? She describes someone who matches Thornfield's description and behavior patterns in the weeks before her disappearance. Compelling circumstantial evidence, but not specific enough for positive identification, Collins replied. The journal entries establish a pattern of predatory behavior, but defense counsel will argue that the descriptions could fit any number of middle-aged men. We need to connect the dots more explicitly. Marcus consulted his notes from the morning's investigation. "We've identified at least 6 other young women who reported similar stalking behavior over the past 15 years. Same general area, same perpetrator description, same pattern of surveillance, followed by a sudden cessation of contact."
That's useful for establishing pattern evidence, but it also creates complications, Collins warned. Defense attorneys will argue that if Thornfield was really a serial stalker, why wasn't he caught earlier? They'll suggest that the pattern evidence is the result of confirmation bias, investigators seeing connections that aren't really there. The legal complexities were frustrating but necessary, each potential objection requiring preparation and response. Sarah had learned over her career that the difference between justice and disappointment often came down to details that seemed irrelevant to everyone except lawyers and judges, procedural requirements that protected defendants' rights even when those rights conflicted with victims' needs for closure. "Timeline for the arrest?" Morrison asked, returning the conversation to immediate practicalities. "This afternoon. Thornfield is scheduled to work until 3:30. We'll take him at the school in coordination with district security to minimize disruption. The search warrants for his residence and vehicle will be executed simultaneously." Sarah felt her pulse quicken at the proximity of action after years of frustrated investigation, but she also understood that arrests were often the easy part of criminal cases. The real work began with interrogation, evidence processing, and the careful construction of narratives that could survive the adversarial testing of trial proceedings. "What about his wife?" Marcus asked. "Margaret Thornfield. Should we consider her a potential witness or a potential accomplice?" "Unknown at this point," Collins admitted. "Spousal privilege limits what she can be compelled to testify about, but if she has relevant knowledge about his behavior or whereabouts, we'll need to approach her carefully. She's not a suspect, but she's not necessarily an ally either." The complexity of family dynamics in criminal cases never ceased to amaze Sarah. Spouses who had lived with defendants for decades often possessed crucial information about behavior patterns, suspicious activities, and timeline details that could make or break prosecutions. But they also had emotional investments in maintaining their version of reality, their understanding of the person they had married and built a life with. "I'll handle the notification to the school district," Morrison said, consulting his watch. "Superintendent Chen needs to prepare for the media response and the impact on staff and students. This is going to be traumatic for everyone who worked with Thornfield." The ripple effects of the arrest would extend far beyond the criminal justice system, affecting every institution and relationship that had been touched by Thornfield's carefully constructed public persona. Children would have to process the revelation that a trusted adult in their environment had been capable of murder. Parents would question their ability to identify threats to their children's safety. Community members would wonder what other secrets might be hiding behind familiar faces. Evidence processing priorities? Sarah asked, thinking ahead to the search warrants that would be executed within hours. Anything that connects him to Elowen specifically. Photographs, personal items, trophies from the crime, but also evidence of the stalking pattern, materials that might help us understand his victim selection process and behavioral escalation. The conversation was interrupted by Morrison's phone, which rang with the insistent tone that indicated emergency dispatch. He answered with his characteristic economy of words, listening for 30 seconds before hanging up with an expression that suggested new complications. Thornfield just called in sick, told his supervisor he has food poisoning and won't be able to finish his shift. He left the school 20 minutes ago. The news transformed the room's energy from methodical preparation to urgent concern. Suspects who altered their routines on the day of planned arrests either possessed supernatural timing or had somehow become aware that their freedom was about to end. Either possibility created dangers for the investigation and potential risks for public safety. Could be coincidence, Marcus offered, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. Could be, Morrison agreed. Or someone tipped him off, or he's developed the kind of paranoia that comes from carrying secrets for 15 years, or he's finally decided to run. Sarah was already reaching for her radio, ready to coordinate surveillance and backup units. What's the plan if he's not at his residence? We proceed with the search warrant regardless. If he's running, we'll find evidence of flight preparation. If he's really sick, we'll find him in bed wondering why police are searching his house.
The uncertainty was maddening, but not unusual. Criminal investigations rarely proceeded according to carefully laid plans, and the most important arrests often involved last-minute complications that tested everyone's ability to adapt and improvise. What mattered now was maintaining the investigation's integrity while responding to changing circumstances that could affect both the immediate arrest and the eventual prosecution. Units are en route to his residence for surveillance, Morrison announced after a brief radio conversation. No sign of his vehicle, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. He could be parked in the garage, or he could be halfway to Canada by now. The next few hours would determine whether 15 years of investigation culminated in justice for Elowen Maren or extended into a fugitive manhunt that could compromise the entire case. William James Thornfield's decision to leave work early had introduced variables that no amount of planning could have anticipated, forcing everyone involved to confront the possibility that their long-awaited breakthrough might slip away just as it seemed within reach. But the DNA evidence remained unchanged. The victim's voice continued to speak through her journal entries, and the machinery of justice had been set in motion with a momentum that would be difficult to stop. Whether Thornfield was hiding in his basement or fleeing across state lines, his genetic signature had finally caught up with him, and his 15 years of freedom were about to end in handcuffs and accusations that could no longer be dismissed or explained away. The parking lot of Cedar Falls Elementary School at 4:17 p.m. resembled a crime scene from a television drama, complete with media vans, worried parents, and the surreal sight of children's playground equipment serving as backdrop for one of the most significant arrests in the county's recent history. Detective Sarah Henley watched through binoculars as William James Thornfield emerged from his residence 3 blocks away, apparently unaware that his house had been under surveillance for the past 2 hours, or that his 15 years of freedom were about to end in the most public way possible. Margaret Thornfield had answered the door when officers executed the search warrant, her face cycling through confusion, denial, and horrified recognition as the reality of her situation became clear. She had been escorted to the police station for questioning, not as a suspect, but as someone whose intimate knowledge of her husband's behavior might provide crucial insights into his psychological patterns and potential hiding places. "He seemed normal this morning," Margaret had told Detective Henley during their initial interview, her voice hollow with the shock of discovering that her marriage had been built on a foundation of deception and violence. maybe a little more distracted than usual, but nothing that seemed... how do you recognize signs of guilt in someone you shared a bed with for 22 years? The question hung in the air like smoke, carrying implications that reach far beyond criminal investigation into the territory of human relationships and the limits of intimate knowledge. Margaret's statement would later become part of the prosecution's case, evidence that Thornfield had successfully compartmentalized his criminal behavior while maintaining an apparently normal family life. But it was Margaret's revelation about her husband's collection of newspaper clippings and photographs related to Elowen's case that provided the most damning evidence of his continued psychological connection to his crime. Hidden in a locked toolbox in their garage, investigators had discovered what amounted to a shrine to his victim. Memorial service programs, news articles about the investigation's progress, even photographs of Elowen that had never been released to the public. "I found some of these things years ago," Margaret had admitted, her voice breaking with the weight of delayed recognition. "I told myself he was just interested in the case because it affected our community. I never imagined. I couldn't let myself imagine what they really meant." The evidence suggested that Thornfield had been psychologically reliving his crime for 15 years, using the community's grief and the ongoing investigation as a way to maintain connection to the power and control he had experienced during Elowen's murder. The photographs in particular indicated that he had possessed information about the crime scene that had never been made public, details that could only have been known by someone who had been present when she died.
His arrest, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic after hours of surveillance and preparation. Thornfield had returned home from an afternoon of what investigators later determined was visiting locations connected to his crime: the bookstore where he had first seen Elowen, the parking lot where he had taken her, the wooded area where her body remained hidden despite 15 years of searches. He had pulled into his driveway with the casual confidence of someone who believed his secrets were safe, unaware that genetic evidence had finally provided the key to unlock the mystery he had created. "William James Thornfield, you're under arrest for the murder of Elowen Maren," Detective Henley had said, her voice carrying 15 years' worth of determination and professional satisfaction. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The words were familiar from countless television shows and movies, but their delivery in this context carried weight that fictional portrayals could never capture. This was justice finally speaking after years of silence, truth finally emerging after decades of concealment, accountability finally arriving for someone who had believed himself beyond the reach of consequences. Thornfield's reaction had been neither the dramatic breakdown nor the defiant denial that often characterized high-profile arrests. Instead, he had simply nodded with what appeared to be resignation, as if some part of him had been expecting this moment for 15 years. His cooperation during the arrest process had been complete but mechanical, suggesting that he had mentally rehearsed this scenario enough times to respond automatically when it finally occurred. "I want to speak to a lawyer," had been his only words during the arrest and initial processing, but even that request had been delivered without urgency or emotion. It was as if the 15 years of hiding had been more exhausting than the prospect of finally being caught, as if some part of him was relieved that the performance was finally over. The community's response to news of the arrest had been swift and devastating, rippling outward from the school district through every social connection and institutional relationship that had been touched by Thornfield's carefully constructed public persona. Parents who had trusted him with their children's safety, colleagues who had worked alongside him for years, neighbors who had borrowed tools and shared casual conversations over backyard fences, all were forced to confront the possibility that they had been fundamentally deceived about someone they thought they knew. Principal Janet Martinez had called an emergency meeting for school staff, her usually composed demeanor cracking under the weight of having to explain to teachers and administrators that someone they had worked with daily was accused of murdering a teenage girl. The revelation was particularly traumatic for employees who had observed Thornfield's interactions with students, who had seen his gentle approach with upset children and his willingness to help with classroom projects. We're going to have counselors available for any staff members who need to process this information, Martinez had announced to the assembled faculty, her voice steady despite the shock that was evident in her expression. We're also implementing additional security measures and reviewing all of our protocols for background checks and employee monitoring. The impact on students had been more complex, filtered through age-appropriate explanations that acknowledged the seriousness of the situation without providing details that could traumatize young minds. Many children had positive memories of Mr. Thornfield, who had fixed broken playground equipment and helped retrieve balls from high places, and always seemed ready with a friendly word when they encountered him in the hallways. How do we explain to a 7-year-old that someone they trusted might have hurt another person? Asked second-grade teacher Rebecca Walsh during the faculty meeting. How do we maintain their sense of safety while also being honest about what's happening? The questions were unanswerable in any definitive sense, part of the broader challenge of helping children navigate a world where evil often wore familiar faces and safety was never guaranteed despite adult promises of protection. Child psychologists would spend weeks working with students who had been affected by the revelation, helping them process complex emotions about trust, safety, and the difference between individual actions and institutional security. But it was the impact on Elowen's family that represented the most profound element of the case's resolution. Tom and Linda Maren had spent 15 years carrying the weight of unanswered questions, the torture of not knowing whether their daughter had suffered, whether her killer was still free to hurt other families, whether justice would ever be possible given the limitations of evidence and time.
The phone call from Detective Henley had found them in their retirement home in Florida, where they had moved after Tom's forced early retirement and Linda's inability to remain in a community where every street corner held memories of their missing daughter. The news of Thornfield's arrest had brought tears that combined relief, grief, and the complex satisfaction of finally having answers to questions that had haunted them for 15 years. "We knew this day might never come," Linda had said during their emotional reunion with investigators at the Cedar Falls Police Department. "There were so many times when we almost gave up hope, when the silence became so overwhelming that we started to accept that we might never know what happened to our Elowen." Tom's response had been more complicated, colored by his professional background in guidance counseling and his understanding of how institutional failures could allow predators to operate undetected. His questions focused on the timeline of Thornfield's employment, his access to children over the years, and the possibility that other victims existed whose cases had never been connected to Elowen's disappearance. "How many other families might there be?" Tom had asked, his voice heavy with the recognition that their daughter's case might be part of a larger pattern of violence. How many other children might have been at risk while this man was walking free? The question would drive the expanded investigation that followed Thornfield's arrest, as detectives worked to identify potential connections between his employment history and other unsolved cases involving young women in southern Indiana. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit would eventually conclude that Elowen's murder had likely been his only completed homicide, but their profile also suggested that his stalking behavior had probably affected dozens of women over the years. Margaret Thornfield's cooperation with investigators had been crucial in understanding the full scope of her husband's criminal behavior. Her access to his personal belongings, his computer files, and his behavioral patterns over 2 decades provided insights that no amount of external investigation could have produced. But her cooperation had come at enormous personal cost, requiring her to accept that the man she had loved and trusted had been capable of violence she could never have imagined. "I keep going back through our entire marriage looking for signs I should have recognized," Margaret had told investigators during one of several lengthy interviews. "I remember nights when he came home late with clothes that were dirty or torn, times when he seemed preoccupied or distant for days at a time.
I told myself these things were normal, that everyone has moods and complications in their work. But now I wonder if I was seeing evidence of, if I was unconsciously ignoring signs that might have saved other people from becoming his victims. The guilt she carried was both understandable and unwarranted. Domestic partners of serial criminals often struggled with retrospective responsibility for signs they felt they should have recognized, but Margaret's self-examination had provided valuable information about Thornfield's behavioral patterns, his use of work-related absences to conceal stalking activities, and his psychological methods for compartmentalizing his criminal behavior from his family responsibilities. Her decision to file for divorce had been announced publicly, accompanied by a statement expressing sympathy for Elowen's family and acknowledgement of her own family's need to distance themselves from the horror that had been committed in their name. But privately, Margaret had also begun working with victim advocates to understand how she and her children could rebuild their lives after discovering that their husband and father was accused of murder. The prosecution of William James Thornfield had proceeded with the methodical precision that characterized high-profile criminal cases in small communities. ADA Patricia Collins had constructed her case around the DNA evidence, while using the circumstantial evidence, the journal entries, the stalking pattern, the trophy collection, to provide context and motive for the scientific proof of his guilt. Thornfield's defense team, led by experienced criminal attorney David Walsh, had focused their strategy on challenging the reliability of genetic evidence that had been stored for 15 years before processing. They had questioned the chain of custody, suggested possible contamination, and argued that technological advances in DNA analysis created opportunities for false positives that hadn't existed when the evidence was originally collected.
But their efforts had been undermined by the overwhelming nature of the circumstantial evidence that supported the genetic findings. Elowen's journal entries describing her stalker matched Thornfield's appearance and behavior patterns with remarkable specificity. His collection of materials related to her case demonstrated ongoing psychological connection to the crime. His work schedule and location history placed him in the right place at the right time to have committed the murder. Most damaging of all was his own behavior during interrogation, where his attempts to explain away the evidence had revealed knowledge of details that had never been made public. "How could I have left DNA evidence if I never touched her?" Thornfield had asked Detective Henley during one of their recorded interviews, apparently unaware that his question revealed knowledge of physical contact that had never been described in media reports. The slip had been small but significant, one of several verbal indicators that suggested guilt despite his formal plea of not guilty. Criminal psychology experts would later analyze the interview transcripts as examples of how guilty suspects often revealed their knowledge through seemingly innocent questions and comments. The trial itself had lasted 3 weeks, during which the prosecution had methodically presented evidence that painted the picture of a man who had successfully hidden his predatory nature while maintaining the facade of community respectability. The jury had deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, and criminal deviant conduct. Thornfield's sentencing had taken place on a gray November morning, exactly 9 months after his arrest and 21 months after the DNA breakthrough that had finally connected him to Elowen's murder. Judge Patricia Harrison had listened to impact statements from Elowen's family, from community members whose sense of safety had been shattered by the revelation of his crimes, and from his own children, who had requested permission to speak about the man they had believed their father to be. "Elowen Maren was 17 years old when you took her life," Judge Harrison had said, her voice carrying the weight of legal authority and human outrage. "She had dreams of college, of becoming a writer, of making a positive impact on the world. You stole all of that from her family, and from our community. You then compounded that evil by living among us for 15 years, accepting our trust while carrying the secret of what you had done." The sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, had been greeted with quiet satisfaction by Elowen's family and supporters, but also with the recognition that no legal consequence could restore what had been lost or undo the damage that had been inflicted on everyone who had been touched by the case. Justice doesn't bring Elowen back, Tom Maren had told reporters after the sentencing, but it does mean that the man who killed our daughter will never again be free to hurt another family. It means that our community can begin to heal from the knowledge that a predator was living among us, trusted with our children's safety while carrying such darkness in his heart. The investigation's conclusion had also brought resolution to the other young women who had reported stalking behavior over the years, providing them with confirmation that their fears had been justified and their reports had been taken seriously even when immediate arrests hadn't been possible. Several of these women had testified during the trial, their accounts of being followed and watched, creating a pattern of behavior that supported the prosecution's portrayal of Thornfield as a serial predator whose violence had escalated to murder in Elowen's case. But the case's resolution had also raised uncomfortable questions about institutional failures that had allowed Thornfield to maintain access to potential victims for years after Elowen's disappearance. The school district had implemented comprehensive reviews of their hiring and monitoring procedures, acknowledging that background checks and references had failed to identify warning signs that might have prevented his employment around children. "We trusted the systems that were supposed to protect our kids," said parent Jennifer Morrison during a school board meeting held 2 weeks after Thornfield's conviction. "We need to understand how those systems failed and what changes are necessary to prevent similar situations in the future." The reforms that followed included enhanced background check procedures, mandatory training for staff members on recognizing predatory behavior, and the implementation of buddy systems that ensured no employee worked alone with children in isolated areas of school buildings. While these measures couldn't guarantee complete safety,
represented the community's commitment to learning from the tragedy and taking concrete steps to prevent similar situations. The story of Elowen Maren represents one of the most profound examples of how tragedy can be transformed into lasting positive change over multiple generations. What began as a devastating cold case murder in Cedar Falls, Indiana, evolved into a multi-decade journey of justice, community healing, and social impact that continues to resonate today. 3 years after William Thornfield's conviction for Elowen's murder, the community had begun the complex process of healing. The Elowen Maren Memorial Garden in Riverside Park served as a focal point for remembrance, designed by her parents, Tom and Linda, to honor their daughter not as a victim, but as the creative, thoughtful young woman who had believed in literature's power to change the world. The garden's granite benches and rotating seasonal flowers created a space where the community could reflect on loss while celebrating Elowen's enduring influence. Detective Sarah Henley's visit to the memorial on the 3rd anniversary carried symbolic weight. She brought white roses and a published collection of Elowen's poetry and journal entries that had become a modest bestseller. The book's proceeds supported a scholarship fund for students pursuing creative writing and victim advocacy, transforming Elowen's unfulfilled literary ambitions into opportunities for others to achieve their educational dreams. The most surprising development came in the form of a letter from Thornfield himself, written from federal prison where he was serving a life sentence. His carefully crafted message to the Maren family expressed remorse and announced his intention to donate his remaining assets to Elowen's scholarship fund. While Tom Maren remained skeptical about the letter's motivations, he recognized the possibility of genuine remorse and the complex nature of forgiveness. The case's impact extended far beyond the immediate victim's family. Margaret Thornfield, who had divorced her husband and returned to her maiden name of Sullivan, faced the unique trauma of learning that someone she had loved and trusted was capable of murder. Her journey toward healing required separating her identity from her former husband's crimes while grappling with guilt over potentially missed warning signs. Margaret's children, Emma and Michael, each found ways to channel their experience into meaningful careers. Emma became a social worker, specializing in trauma recovery, while Michael pursued prosecution work, driven by a desire to ensure other victims received the justice their father had tried to deny Elowen. Their name changes represented both a practical distancing from their father's crimes and a symbolic reclaiming of their own identities. The support systems that developed around families of offenders proved crucial for their healing process. Margaret's participation in support groups and victim advocacy work demonstrated how those indirectly harmed by violent crime could transform their guilt and grief into positive action, contributing to prevention efforts and community healing. Jake Maren's career path as a guidance counselor represented another form of transformation through service. Working at the same high school his sister had attended, Jake focused on helping teenagers navigate emotional complexities while staying alert to signs of depression, anxiety, and trauma that might require intervention. His presentations on mental health and emotional wellness drew directly from his family's experience, emphasizing that seeking help for struggling individuals represented love, not betrayal. Jake's work embodied a crucial aspect of Elowen's legacy, the understanding that prevention required community awareness and proactive support for vulnerable young people. His efforts to normalize mental health discussions and provide resources for students created protective factors that might prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. The case's reach expanded significantly through various media representations that maintained respect for Elowen's memory while serving educational purposes. A true crime podcast featuring her case reached over 2 million downloads, but distinguished itself through its focus on Elowen's life and dreams rather than sensationalizing the murder details. The podcast generated new leads in other unsolved cases, while raising funds for the scholarship program.
Amanda Chen, the podcast's creator, exemplified responsible true crime journalism by treating cold cases as stories about real people deserving justice rather than entertainment puzzles. This approach influenced broader conversations about ethical true crime reporting and the importance of centering victims' humanity in such narratives. The establishment of the Elowen Maren Creative Writing Center at Indiana University represented perhaps the most concrete realization of her literary aspirations. Housed in a renovated Victorian building, the center provided space for students to develop their writing skills while learning about the intersection of creativity and social advocacy. Professor Jennifer Walsh's leadership of the center was particularly meaningful, as she had been one of Thornfield's stalking victims in 2011. Her survival and subsequent career development demonstrated resilience, while her teaching emphasized writers' ethical responsibilities when addressing real-world trauma and injustice. The center's innovative partnership with law enforcement agencies provided creative writing workshops for police officers and investigators. This program, based on research linking narrative writing to improved empathy and communication skills, helped first responders process traumatic experiences while developing better victim interaction capabilities. Detective Sarah Henley's post-retirement consulting work illustrated how expertise developed through major cases continued to serve justice efforts decades later. Her involvement in investigating crimes with behavioral patterns similar to Thornfield's demonstrated the ongoing value of institutional knowledge and the importance of recognizing criminal behavioral patterns. The arrest of Marcus Webb, whose crimes were inspired by his research into Thornfield's case, highlighted the dark reality that violent criminals often study and attempt to emulate successful predators. This insight informed new training protocols emphasizing information sharing and cold case maintenance as tools for preventing copycat crimes and serial escalation. Sophia Blackwood's doctoral research on cold case resolution's community impact revealed crucial insights about collective trauma and healing. Her interviews with Cedar Falls residents demonstrated that knowing the truth, even terrible truth, proved ultimately more healing than living with uncertainty and suspicion. The revelation that Thornfield had been a trusted community member was horrific, but also provided the closure necessary for healing to begin.
This research contributed to growing scholarship about criminal justice's intersection with public health, emphasizing timely case resolution's importance for community well-being and collective healing processes. The documentary film about Elowen's case, which premiered at Sundance and achieved widespread distribution, represented a mature artistic treatment of her story. Executive producer Emma Thornfield Morrison's involvement ensured the film honored Elowen's memory while acknowledging the complex trauma experienced by offenders' families. The film's approach reflected evolving understanding of trauma as a community experience requiring comprehensive response rather than focusing solely on immediate victims. This perspective influenced restorative justice approaches that addressed harm more holistically. 35 years after Elowen's murder, her impact continues through multiple channels. The Memorial Garden has matured into a beloved community space where families gather, students read, and visitors from around the world come to understand how one voice refused to be silenced. Detective Sarah Henley's regular visits with her great-granddaughter Claire represent the intergenerational transmission of Elowen's values and the enduring importance of her story. Claire's own aspiration to write stories that help people and make things better demonstrates how Elowen's influence continues to inspire new generations. The memorial's inscription, "She believed that stories could change the world," has proven prophetic, as her story continues to generate positive change through education, advocacy, and creative expression.
The Elowen Maren case ultimately demonstrates that justice extends far beyond solving crimes or punishing wrongdoers. True justice involves creating communities where creativity flourishes, young people feel safe to pursue dreams, and memory serves not as a burden of grief, but as inspiration for building a better world. Elowen's final poem, with its themes of hope planting seeds in darkness and justice finding its way to every waiting truth, has proven remarkably prescient. Her voice, silenced by violence but preserved through writing, continues speaking to new generations about hope's power, truth's importance, and love's ultimate triumph over darkness. The transformation of tragedy into lasting positive change through scholarship programs, educational initiatives, policy reforms, artistic expression, and community healing represents perhaps the most meaningful form of justice possible. Elowen's legacy lives not in the darkness that claimed her life, but in the continuing light her memory shines into countless other lives, demonstrating how one person's story can indeed change the world, one reader, one student, one community at a time. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.